Diana started out by talking about the time that she spent in Gaza and what the water situation was like, and suggested that it's probably worse now, and I'm pretty sure that it is. 95% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable. Children are going to school every day, coming home, playing, running around, playing soccer, and where do they go when they get thirsty? There's generally nowhere to go. If their parents can afford bottled water, then they get to drink some of that. But many families in Gaza and also in the West Bank can't afford bottled water. So several years ago, a group of children called the Children's Parliament at a UN school in Gaza had the opportunity to vote on one thing they wanted for their school, and what they chose was to have drinking water. And that eventually got communicated to our Gaza Projects coordinator, Dr. Mona Farah, and that was the beginning of the Maya Project, which has, at this point, installed 27 units in Gaza schools and UN schools and independent kindergartens and preschools. Approximately 30,000 children are now able to drink clean, safe water. So your donation will go towards that project. Whatever you can give, whatever amount feels a little bit uncomfortable, something that you know you can give, that the amount of a movie and dinner, something like that. Something that's not easy, but it is just a little bit uncomfortable. And
what effect has that had on the resistance movement? Has it created, has it become an opportunity for people to really band together, or has it created more divisiveness?
It's a really good question. I just came back from Palestine, actually. I was there about a week ago. I'm not really sure what time zone I'm in at this point, but what was interesting with the Palestine Papers and the revelations that came out with the Palestine Papers was, at first, the revelations resulted in people really looking at Al Jazeera, and a lot of the criticism being focused on Al Jazeera. With people saying, Al Jazeera shouldn't really meddle in Palestinian affairs. Al Jazeera is, obviously has some grander picture that it has in mind. Al Jazeera is a configuration of Qatar, and it's the Qataris who want to get involved. This lasted for about 2 or 3 days, and at the same time, the Egyptian uprising was happening. So what ended up happening is following the end of Mubarak, and I arrived the day after he stepped down, people were a lot more inquisitive and really looking into the Palestine Papers, and beginning to really challenge a lot of the things that were coming out of the Palestine Papers. So initially, while the focus may have been on Al Jazeera, and people saying, well, we know they're going to sell away the house anyway, after the resignation of Mubarak, there started to be a lot more introspection and a lot more criticism against the Palestinian Authority. What happened almost immediately after that was, the first was that the Palestinian negotiator resigned, which was a good thing. The second thing was that Abu Mazen sacked the government, and there hasn't been a new cabinet formed ever since. The third was that the Prime Minister, who is an appointed Prime Minister, he's never been elected, now suddenly felt the need to start engaging Palestinians on who should be in the cabinet. And so he did things like set up a Facebook account, met with youth groups. He's been doing all of these sort of basic consultations to try to make it look as though he's very inclusive. thing that he did, which was interesting, was he's reached out to Hamas and said to Hamas that he'd be willing to form a government with Hamas. Now, all of these things, I posit, are for show. These are all being done for PR. But what isn't being done for PR, which is what is much more important, is that there's a lot more energy in Palestine than there was before, and a lot more introspection of the government than there had been before. So rather than people now dismissing the actions of the government as we all knew that they were going to sell the house, people are now beginning to demand transparency and accountability. And it's still not at the place where it needs to be. The slogans are very different in Palestine than they were in Egypt.
Hi. Because you were a negotiator for, I guess, several years, 5 years, I was kind of hoping for a slightly more personal thought. And I'm curious about who you are, how you got invited to be the only woman on the team, why you accepted, and also what you learned during those 5 years. I'm sort of like...
I was actually going to give a personal talk, but I decided that's it, but on the personal side, I'll try to be very, 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 very brief. On the personal side, my parents raised me without a Palestinian identity. My parents came to Canada in 1967, and because of a series of events that had happened in Palestine to them, they didn't want me to have any political upbringing or any identity that was Palestinian. And so the word Palestinian wasn't mentioned in our household. The word Israel wasn't mentioned in the household. I didn't speak Arabic. The only thing that I knew about my parents was that they were from Nazareth. That was it. And at a certain point, being very young and very naive and not very bright, I thought that Nazareth was a country. That was how my world was shaped. This all changed in 1987. When, as a teenager, I visited Palestine for the very first time. I arrived on the first day of the Palestinian uprising, the first uprising. So that politicized you. And ended up staying for about 3 weeks. But I still didn't really know what was going on. And I was I think, too young to really recognize what was happening. But one thing that I learned was I met cousins who I hadn't seen for practically my whole life, who really tried to give me an education and tell me that I was Palestinian, and tell me what it meant to be Palestinian. And so I was very deeply moved by that experience of visiting Palestine for the first time, and by being basically told that I was Palestinian. It was shocking, actually, for me. I immediately decided that I was going to learn Arabic, which I did. I immediately decided that I wanted to learn more about Palestine, which I tried to do and still try to do every day. And it continued to be so moved by Palestine that I devoted a lot of my university years to Palestine, to being an activist. The problem came in 1993, in September of 1993. I, like many others, witnessed the handshake on the White House lawn, the very famous handshake, and was very moved by that handshake. So moved that I put everything Palestinian out of my mind because I thought that everything was somehow going to be resolved. And I continued to delude myself thinking that everything was going to be fine and resolved. And I remember in 1994, November of 1994, Edward Said came to my University of Law School. And he came forward, and I was the only Palestinian in law school at the time. So we had lunch, and he said to me, nothing is going to come of these negotiations. And I remember being really dismayed by him. And I remember thinking, who's this Edward Said character, like, ruining my little peace party that I was having. And being very bothered by his talk in general, but by his political outlook. And I continue to have him in the back of my mind, but I continue to somehow believe that negotiations were going to be successful. And yet I continue to visit Palestine every summer, and I continue to see that things were actually getting worse, that there were now checkpoints in place, which there hadn't been before, that there was a delineation of territory, and the territory was quite small for Palestinians, that there were still refugee camps, that more and more settlements were being established, were being built. But following each trip, I continued to believe that negotiations were going to yield something. I mean, this was, I deluded myself, I'm being quite honest. And it all sort of came to a head in the year 2000. In 2000, I was studying not too far from here, and I made I started a friendship with a man who was from Tel Aviv, a Jewish Israeli man who lived in Tel Aviv. And at the time, the Camp David negotiations had just concluded. We were sitting in a lounge area together, we were watching television, and my friend turned to me and he said, "What is wrong with you Palestinians?" And I said, "What do you mean? What's wrong with us Palestinians?" And he said, look at, the President Clinton is talking about how great an offer Iraq gave to Arafat, and what is wrong with you people? And I remember saying, okay, well, what was the great offer? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, what did he say when it came to settlements? So the settlement's going to go away. And I said, I don't know. I said, what's going to happen to Jerusalem? He said, I don't know. And I said, well, what's going to happen to Palestinian refugees? Are they going to be allowed to return to their homes or what? And he said, I don't think so, but I don't know. And I said, well, what do you know? Tell me what I'm missing. And he said, all I know is that you've given up the best offer. So that actually was the reason that I ended up moving to Palestine, was that conversation that I had. And so when I got to Palestine, I still somehow believed, I was still delusional. I was drinking too much of the Kool-Aid and thinking that there was going to be, that it was still possible to have a negotiated settlement. And I continued to believe that for about a year, for a little under a year. The time when things ended up changing for me was when the actual negotiations took place. There's a lot of work that goes on behind closed doors that is not negotiations. But when we actually were face-to-face in a room setting, that's when I realized that there was never going to be any successful negotiations. Now why? It was because there was never any real basis for negotiations. It was all based on power. So this is a real conversation that happened while facing that. At one point, there was an Israeli negotiator, and he said he was demanding a series of what they call early warning stations to be placed in the West Bank. An early warning station is the presence of the Israeli army, for lack of a better word, to define the century. And he wanted 5 of these stations in the West Bank. The West Bank is tiny, and the United States as a whole, I think, only has 3. And so they were demanding 5 in the West Bank. And I turned to the Israeli negotiator and said, on what basis are you demanding 5 early warning stations? And his response was, because I can. Because I'm the more powerful party, and because I can. And then I said, well, being a lawyer, on what basis of international law? And he said, forget about the law. There is no law here. It's just you and me in a room. Forget about the law. And that's what really struck it home for me. It wasn't just that conversation, but that conversation is an example. That we realized that there's a context of power that we as Palestinians would never be able to change that power dynamic, because no matter what we continue to negotiate or concede or do whatever, it was never going to be enough for Israel, because they could just simply demand more and ask for more and get more.
And do you think Israel would ever really give up being
spoke of earlier of dividing Palestinians into these different groups also has had the effect of dividing Palestinians into this one-state camp or two-state camp, with that division in some cases being insurmountable between groups, with groups not wanting to work together because of this sort of one-state or two-state. I think that the much more important thing for me, at least, is to focus on the struggle and focus on really trying to address the rights-based issues that Israel doesn't want to address. And from there, different things will flow. So what is the from there that I would like? I'm personally not in favor of division. I'm personally not in favor of a state that defines itself on ethnic lines. I'm not in favor of a state that defines itself on religious lines. And so that's where my sympathies lie. But at the same time, I recognize that, one, I don't speak on behalf of everybody, so I can't decide. But two, and more importantly, that I'm not under any illusion that a one-state concept is going to be any better off for Palestinians whatsoever. Because right now, even if you look at the statistics right now, the numbers game, which is what everybody looks at, which I reject. I think that is an absolutely wrong concept. But the numbers game, if you look at the numbers of the number of Palestinians, or what Israel would call non-Jews, and the number of Jews in the country, the difference between the two right now is a mere 200,000 or 300,000. So the question for me is not when it will become one state, it already is. And the question is not when it will be apartheid, it already is. I think that instead we should be really focusing on the concept of apartheid and trying to dismantle the apartheid that is in place.
But I grew up as an ethnic Jew who became anti-Zionist in 1956 at the time of the Suez invasion.
Material interest different between the PLO/PA and others, yes. There's a huge disparity between the two. This has been one of the outcomes of Oslo and the Oslo process, was that there's been a lot of pumping of money into in particular the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, in order to serve the Palestinian Authority. I mean, what's interesting is if you look at the composition of the Palestinian Authority and the people who are now in the security services of the Palestinian Authority, those individuals were initially people who were resisting Israel's occupation, but have now been brought in to become part of the system of people who are, in a way, defending Israel's occupation. This is not to say that the individuals are defending Israel's occupation, but the system definitely is now beginning to serve that function. And the security services of the PA, we've now got more security per capita than any place around the world. And there's more police force and more security per capita than any other country around the world by far. This is not, we're a close second, because somebody's a close second, it's a far second. And it's because of this concept of having the Palestinian Authority as being a pseudo-government that really controls nothing, but a pseudo-government whose sole purpose is to continue to promote both the peace process and continue to, in a way, make sure that the situation is quiet so that Israel can continue doing what it's been wanting to do. Now, this process has been accompanied by a lot of money, with more than 60% of the Palestinian Authority's daily budget costs not being able to be met by Palestinian sources. So 60% of the budget actually comes from Europeans and from the United States and from Canada, from Japan. As a result, there's been two main employers now in Palestine. One is the government, and number two is a series of groups and groups and groups of NGOs. Both of these are now under the thumb of Western donors. So if Western donors don't like what you're doing, then they cut off the funds. This is why they cut off the funds when the Hamas government was elected. This has really led to a split in material and other interests between Palestinians who are associated with the PLO and Palestinians who are not associated with the PLO/PA. The interests are not just financial, but it goes actually much deeper than that, which is that it's that the financial tap will be cut off if they don't abide by the rules that have been laid out for them. Just in the same way that when it came to Egypt, that if Egypt chose in any way to even question the Camp David agreement with Israel, that money tap would also be turned off. Now, in terms of the boycott and the demand for boycott, the main boycott is a boycott that was put forward, was a boycott call that was put forward in 2005. It came exactly 1 year after the International Court of Justice's ruling on Israel's wall. And it was because the International Community had done nothing to implement the decision on the wall. And the boycott call is actually very wide in scope. It does demand, it does focus on the regime of apartheid. It focuses on the right of return. It's as kind of as broad as you want it to be, but individual groups have tried to tailor it and narrow it to be much more focused on, tactically on things related to just 67 or just those companies that are doing business with the military establishment.
Boycotting Berkeley, Stanford, the New York Harmonica. It makes no sense to go after this state, except for concession too, in terms of what anti-Semitism.
In terms of the issue of revolutionary movements, the original call for the PLO was certainly one state, and it certainly focused on imperialism, but I think we can't delude ourselves into believing that Zionism isn't an enemy of the Palestinian people. It is. It really is. The idea that somehow you're going to replace one people with another is the enemy of Palestinian identity. It's the enemy of my Palestinian presence, my being. So I think we really have to question and start challenging Zionism. Zionism as a whole, not just Zionism as it pertains to the 67 borders, not just Zionism in terms of Greater Israel, but Zionism as a concept in the way that it has been implemented that seeks to replace one people with another. And that is something that I really think we have to start questioning and demanding. Now, in terms of boycotts and boycotting the anti-Semitic, this is precisely what Israel would want you to believe. Israel wants you to believe that any criticism against Israel is somehow anti-Semitic. It's not. It's anti-Zionist. And so the idea, and there's something actually innately anti-Semitic about the concept of Israel, which is that a nation speaks on behalf of an entire people. I mean, can you imagine that this is not considered to be anti-Semitic? That an entire people is spoken for because on behalf of one nation, that one nation speaks on behalf of every single Jew. I mean, that itself is a concept that is anti-Semitic. And so to somehow equate criticism of Israel as being anti-Semitic is precisely what Israel wants us to do. It's not. The criticism of Israel is against its policies. It's against the actions that it's taking. It's against the concept of Zionism. But it has absolutely nothing to do with anti-Semitism. In fact, as you now know, why are we just focusing on Israel? Why not focus on every other question? I think that in part it's because of the way that the Palestinian national movement defined itself, parts of the Palestinian national movement defined itself for so many years, which is that the struggle, that the terminology that they've used is not language of apartheid, it's not language of discrimination. It's been largely language of building a state and of ending occupation. And so when you posit yourself as a movement that aims to build a state on an extended territory, or when you posit yourself as an organization that is just focused on 1967 borders or whatever it is, then it's easy to be able to bring in supporters who are Zionists, but happen to be liberal Zionists as well. It's when the movement begins to posit itself as something bigger than that and different than that, that's when you exactly come up with this clash of should there be progressive Zionists involved in the movement. Now for me, I think that it's not just a question of who's in the movement or who's not in the movement, but how the movement defines itself. And from the definition of itself, people will self-select and self-include. Now, if you just focus on being a state, if you just focus on negotiating a certain number of borders, if you simply focus on ending the occupation, then you're really only focusing on one very small portion of what's going on. This conflict to me is not about land at all. It's a bigger issue, which is that of replacing one people with another. And it's when you focus on that